Tactically, the Russians are still advancing, but that doesn't matter because you're achieving things elsewhere. That stalled slightly. So I think we're almost at a point of impasse at the moment where no one side has actually got the initiative. And I'd sort of expect that coming into the autumn when it's very difficult for military maneuver, and coming into the winter. Russia's trying to achieve things with bringing North Korean troops in. The Ukraine is hoping for more and more Western weapon systems that are coming in. We're in that stalemate situation at the moment. I personally think that Ukraine will continue its special operations executive type activity, and we'll see an increase of that through the winter months in Russia. That is having a disproportionate effect on Russia's ability to maintain its frontline capability, and we'll start to see that impacting Russia much more through the end of 2024 into early 2025. And I think Ukraine will wrestle the initiative back properly towards mid-2025.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are catching up with a former military intelligence officer with the British Army, Colonel Philip Ingram. During his 26 years with the armed forces, Philip commanded one military intelligence battalion, and he is now a military analyst and commentator. Philip, great to see you again. Thank you so much for your time. Let's start with the BRICS summit in Russia, the economic bloc as a rival to the West and the G7. Vladimir Putin proclaimed on day 2 of this summit that it was the start of a new world order. Is this summit actually a political win for him, or is this wishful thinking?
It's a bit of both. BRICS was set up in 2009, I think, as a rival to the G7. So it's bringing together originally Brazil, India, Russia, South Africa, and China. And when you look at that from an economic powerhouse across the world, we're talking of sort of over 40% of the world's land mass that's in there, a very large percentage of the global population, and therefore, a huge economic power block. And it's bringing it together from an economic perspective to try and rival the Western economic blocks that are out there. It's slightly different in that the motivations of the different countries that are in it, and those are the core members. There are, I think, 9 members in total, and then they've got a large number of associate members, which is why we see the likes of, and aspiring members, which is why we see the likes of President Erdogan from Turkey turning up at the meeting, and elsewhere. And I heard only this morning that they've accepted another 13 members in as associate members. So it's growing and growing and growing. The more it gets together from an economic perspective, the more power it's got. But the difference that I'd say that there is between BRICS and G7 is that G7, people have got a common interest. The countries have got a common interest, and they tend to focus much better together and help each other's economies. Within BRICS, it's much more of, what can I get out of you? So you don't have that political relationship that there is in bringing things together. It's more of, what can we suck out of the organization? But that doesn't mean to say it's not powerful and it's not important.
And the attendance of the UN Secretary General and Antonio Guterres, it was a big shock, and he defended it by saying exactly the point you made, that the grouping represented half the world's population, so he needed to be there. What effect did this presence have?
Yeah, I'm torn by his attendance. I agree with what he's saying in that the influence he's got to be there. However, he didn't need to welcome President Putin or his foreign minister Lavrov in the way that he did. It would have been balanced if he'd actually attended the international peace summit that had happened in Switzerland with regard to the war in Ukraine, and therefore, he, in all of his activities, it seems to be courting more the Russian side rather than looking at things from a balanced perspective with other international meetings and activities that are going on around the world. So he's imbalanced in his view, and therefore I think his attendance here from an optics perspective is wrong, very wrong indeed. Looking at it globally with what's going on around the globe. From a pure economic and pure, he's the Secretary General of the United Nations, and therefore he should attend these sorts of things. Yes, of course he should, but he's getting the balance wrong.
And attitudes to the war in Ukraine are on the agenda at this meeting. We're speaking early on Thursday morning, UK time. We don't know yet what any declaration will involve regarding the war. There is no absolute consensus, though, with the members who are there, is there?
No, definitely not. And a large proportion of the members don't support Russia's activities inside Ukraine or abstain in the United Nations votes that are there. But it's the majority that don't support. However, some of the core elements, we're seeing an increasing relationship between China and Russia, and then Russia's relationships that is building up in what people refer to as the Crink countries, which are all associated in with BRICS. So Crink is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and that's the military grouping coming together that is worrying people. But again, I think it suffers from the same thing that BRICS does, in that it's not a grouping of people coming together for a collective defense or a collective understanding as to how to move forward together. It's people come together in a what can I get out of you type scenario.
There's been a lot of tension on the deployment of North Korean troops to help Russia in the war in Ukraine. How good are they? What do you know about them?
North Korea is interesting. It has got one of the largest militaries in the world. Per head of population, I think there's over 29% of the North Korean adult population are in the military. But their military is very much based on old Soviet style, old communist style militaries. So it is very rigid, very formed. It's got on paper 1.2, 1.4 million troops with another 500,000 in reserve. That sounds enormous. It's got thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, one of the biggest submarine fleets that there is in Southeast Asia. So on paper, it is very, very strong. But if we look back to 2.5 years ago when Russia reinvaded Ukraine, on paper, Russia was a very, very strong military. It hasn't been able to have a massive impact or defeat the Ukrainian military. And North Korea suffers from the same thing. They've got no combat experience whatsoever in their troops. Their troops are well equipped, but with bad equipment, and that bad equipment is badly maintained. It is designed to work for the showpieces that the North Korean leader comes out to see. So Kim Jong-un, he'll go out, and their training is very serialized. So nothing happens randomly in their training. It is you follow each serial as if it's a script in a play, and that means that their troops have not been properly trained in a combat environment, and therefore if it came to them fighting a war as North Korea, I think they'd struggle. But they have volume, and volume speaks all by itself. When it comes to integrating inside Russia, it's going to be interesting to see how they integrate with the Russian troops when they appear in the front line, if they appear in the front line, or are they supporting troops behind? Because there's a large proportion of North Korean equipment and ammunition and other things coming into Russia. They may be helping with some more technical areas, but we've heard of North Korean Special Forces, and they've got one of the biggest special forces organizations of any country in the world. But how good they are is really difficult to work out. On paper and theoretically, they look brilliant, but the reality in combat is very, very different indeed.
And how will this closer alliance affect Russia's relations with China?
Well, China and North Korea, China is effectively the big uncle for North Korea. They are the country that has enabled North Korea to continue to exist. They supported North Korea obviously during the Korean War in the 50s. They've continued to maintain that support, that economic support, and wider political support. And we've seen Kim Jong-un jump in his great train and take it up to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping on various occasions. But it's this increasing relationship that North Korea has got with Russia, and there's economic elements to that. And I suspect there's some Russian hands in that, in developing the relationship in a way that China can get a little bit more out of Russia, what China wants. But that's bringing this BRICS community together. The Crink community together, and that, from a military perspective, is worrying. But I wouldn't be overly concerned about it at the moment.
Just on a slightly different subject, the West has often been criticised for neither deterring nor reacting to Russian aggression. For example, when it invaded Georgia or annexed Crimea.
Yeah.
Do you believe it's proactive enough against the less obvious ways that Russia tries to destabilize Western countries?
Oh, it's not proactive at all when it comes to less obvious ways of the way Russia's trying to destabilize different countries. And this, I'll go back quickly to North Korea. North Korean troops, those are foreign troops supporting Russia in a fight in Ukraine. That is something that could stimulate and should stimulate NATO discussing whether we are going to put NATO troops in to support Ukraine inside Ukraine to allow the Ukrainians to go off and fight the Russians in different ways, because politically the game has changed. But Russia's been playing this game the whole way through for many, many years. In the information sphere, they own it. They are influencing our democratic processes, and we've got the U.S. presidential election coming up. There's a lot of eyes watching for Russian influence on that, and Russian influence doesn't come in with big flags waving behind the videos with Vladimir Putin, putting the speeches out in bits and pieces. No, it's political commentators. It's well-known names that have been hired through perfectly legitimate companies, but the script that they are dealing with has been written in a careful way to try and look at those that are undecided voters and push them one way or the other. And a lot of political commentators will see that as just political campaigning, political commentary, but it's who's funding it and who's behind it and how they're pushing the message. And then we're seeing other activities like sabotage activities and other things across Europe. We've had the recent incidents where an aircraft out of Leipzig, a DHL aircraft, had a potential explosive device on it. We've seen the same in the UK. We've had Director General of MI5 turn around and discuss how foreign activity inside the UK has ramped up dramatically and is causing them real difficulties. We are not proactive in any way, from what I can see, in dealing with this.
And how could we be more proactive?
That's the difficult one, because the Russia and China's at it as well, and Iran's at it as well. They can operate out with the law. They will influence things. They are helping fund the groups that are behind the protests that we're seeing in our capitals. They're helping to fund the disinformation that we're seeing around what's going on inside the Middle East to try and cause political capital to be used in a way where it's not focusing on what would be Putin's concerns, i.e. Russia into Ukraine and everything like that. So it's lots of little activities across the board. It's very difficult in a democracy where our government is focused on soundbite politics and what is coming into tomorrow morning's headline, for them to take a step back, look at this from a wider perspective, and to try and deal with it in a proactive way, and an overt proactive way. The speech that we heard from the Director General of MI5 heartened me in that our intelligence agencies recognize this, and our intelligence agencies behind closed doors are being as proactive as they can to try and disrupt the criminal gangs that Russia is using, the influencers that are out there, where there's websites that are tied up with pushing disinformation out. They're working with their international partners to try and disrupt it. But that doesn't stop the messaging then getting through to the masses and the effect that the Russians are trying to have on the masses. And that's the bit where it's really, really difficult. I think we need a specialist pan-government unit that is proactive, that isn't under the level of political control that messaging comes out from Western governments. And it's not just the UK. You look at the US as to what's coming out. It's all focused on making sure it doesn't upset a particular element of the electorate because of the critical elections that are coming up. The new government in the UK is focused on trying to hide away from all of the scandals that keep coming out. Well, some of that expose is probably coming from Russian-backed operatives that are pushing the messaging out, because they find all of this. They spend years researching, getting the compromat, getting it in position, and then when they want to disrupt and stop political capital being used from an international perspective, they'll fire all this out in through legitimate channels. Really difficult to stop, if not impossible.
Do you think Russian black ops have changed and evolved?
I think Russian black ops have changed and evolved significantly over the years, and they've become bolder and more proactive. And the examples of that are the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko with polonium-210 on the streets of London. A radiological agent that can only be produced in a nuclear reactor. The poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia on the streets of Salisbury, and we've got, at the moment, the coroner's inquiry into the death of Dawn Sturgis, who was poisoned by Novichok after her boyfriend had found the bottle. To use those sorts of agents, and the more digging there is with that, you can see more of this sort of activity going on across the whole of Europe with assassinations and warehouse fires and other things. They are getting bolder because we are not being proactive enough in dealing with those that are behind it and hitting them with the only way that they understand, either economically or physically.
If the intention, as recently stated by the head of MI5, who you mentioned, Britain's domestic counterintelligence and security agency, is to create sustained mayhem on British and European streets, why is Moscow stepping up these sabotage attacks? What does it want to achieve?
Well, what it wants to achieve is to try and fracture relationships across the international community. So look at what's going on in the EU, try and fracture the EU, try and fracture the EU-UK relationship post-Brexit, try and fracture the UK-US relationship, the Five Eyes community, and to occupy political capital, political thinking time in activities that stop our politicians from focusing on some of the major world issues. So focusing on the Russia-Ukraine war. When we've got our Prime Minister, our Deputy Prime Minister, our Chancellor of the Exchequer, our Foreign Minister, and others tied up with Taylor Swift tickets, that will take an hour of their day or half an hour of their day, 5 days a week. That's an hour or half an hour that they can't spend on other more important issues. And you add lots of these little things together, and there's the good old Chinese proverb of death of 1,000 cuts. Well, you can stop people from doing things by delivering so many activities that they have to deal with because it's today's or tomorrow morning's headlines, that they don't have time to put decent thinking into what they should be doing from an international perspective. And while that's happened, Putin's laughing all the way to the bank.
Yeah, and just for people who don't follow UK politics really, really closely, the Taylor Swift tickets, that was alluding to a big row here in Britain about freebies being offered to politicians. And yeah, we won't talk any more about that.
No. That's a rabbit hole we don't want to go down.
I'm really not going there. I wasn't even interested in, well, anyway, let's not go there. So you mentioned the incendiary devices, that one was found in the UK and one was found before it was put on a plane in Germany.
Yeah.
Can you just explain a little bit more about these? Were cargo planes, or destined for cargo planes, as I understand it. What do you think? The finger has been pointed at Moscow for this. What's going on here? Is it scoping out the potential for causing havoc, or what do you think?
I think it is scoping out the potential for causing havoc, but it's also creating another dilemma. And I go back to my death of 1,000 cuts. It's yet another dilemma that the security service is going to have to look at. It's another dilemma that air freight and air cargo companies are going to have to then start to bring in additional screening for their cargoes to make sure they understand what could be if there's any threats being put on. It will affect our airports, which are all critical national infrastructure. It affects our supply chain, which is critical national infrastructure. So it's causing an element of disruption. But these activities are what would be classed as below the threshold. They're below the threshold of anything that would stimulate a direct response from the West against Russia. And actually, they're below the threshold where it makes it very difficult to positively confirm exactly who is behind it. And the Russians then combine that with maskirovka, masking, their disinformation campaign. That's part of their doctrine, to be able to throw people off the scent and create that doubt. And governments are not going to react and formally blame Russia for anything and then take physical action unless they are 100% certain. And even then, that physical action is likely to be no more than a stiff letter.
That's what makes it so difficult, though, isn't it? Because if it is below the threshold, if you can't categorically point the finger, then what do you do?
Well, it's the stiff letter that comes out, but also you combine that with sanctions, and we're starting to see the sanctions that were imposed after the Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine 2.5 years ago are biting inside Russia. When individuals get sanctioned, some of them, it doesn't affect them in the slightest because they haven't done anything, but others with their international business are having real difficulty where their business assets are being frozen, and there needs to be greater cooperation in doing that sort of activity. All the oligarchs have lost their their massive motor yachts. That will impact their families. They've lost their ability to travel around the world. That's having an impact, but it's still nowhere near enough to send that clear message into Vladimir Putin and the other oligarchs to stop this activity, and therefore it's emboldening them, and they're just carrying out more and more and more. And I think we could see it ramping up, and we could even get to the potential where we'll see an increase in state-sponsored terror activity that's going on. That's what worries me most.
In terms of prevention, just looking at Moldova and the recent
Right.
voting there, wild allegations of Russian interference and buying of votes. The incumbent president faces a runoff next month against a pro-Russian candidate. That she predicted this months ago that Russia would be tampering with this election, because she said that the signs were there. They tried with the energy and failed. They tried to overthrow the government, she said, and failed. And they failed and predicted that this would happen in the elections. Why was there no way to stop this when it was so widely forecast?
Because the way of attack going in is not something that is physical, that you can then put something in place to defend against it. It's psychological. And the Russian disinformation campaign, their targeted information operations that they put out, will be changing the way individuals inside Moldova think. And people say, "Oh, you can't do that." But actually, if those that are listening to it, if you think of your favorite advert that and marketing campaign that you've seen, whether it be for something that you use domestically or for your favorite sports team or for something else, and think back a few years ago and for marketing campaigns that you grew up with that you can still remember today, and you can remember the music in some of them, you can remember the imagery in others, you can remember the sound bites that come through. For the UK audience, if I say hands that do dishes, people will know of a particular brand of washing up liquid, and that's manipulating the way your brain thinks, because whenever you say that to people, and Kate, you just smiled when I said that, people smile. You're changing people's feelings. And you're changing people's feelings by changing the chemical balance that people have with their endorphins and their oxytocin and their serotonin, etc., inside their brain, because you're dealing with that. That's what Russia does when it reinforces how the messaging is getting across, and it will do that having utilized big data, looking at what people's thinking is on social media, on their Facebook posts and Instagram posts, X posts, and everything else, pulling all of that together to say, we know in this town people are sitting on the fence because of this, right? Let's reinforce that so that they come off that fence and focus on us. You only have to change a very small percentage of people's views to actually have a massive impact from a democratic perspective. This is where Russia's approach is undermining our whole democratic processes, and that is what we should be most concerned about, I think.
Let's just talk briefly about the war in Ukraine, what's going on the battlefield right now. Which side do you see as having the initiative?
Yes, that's an interesting one. Ukraine took the initiative back when it started its counteroffensive last year. It wasn't ready for that counteroffensive. It didn't have the military capability, the tactical military capability, to be able to get through the Russian defenses in the east, which are better than any defenses I've ever seen, ever, including in the Second World War. And the international community was expecting Ukraine to take big chunks back, like they had with Kharkiv and Kherson beforehand. And then when Ukraine stalled, the international support waned slightly, and Russia then regained the initiative from a tactical perspective and started to make very slow advances. As Russia's making slow advances, Ukraine's on the back foot. Russia's dictating the pace. Ukraine comes out with a novel idea, and that's to go into the Kursk region and takes the Kursk region and starts to attack into there. Ukraine then wrestles the initiative back from Russia because Ukraine is dictating the pace of what's happening from a strategic and an operational perspective. Tactically, the Russians are still advancing, but that doesn't matter because you're achieving things elsewhere. That stalled slightly. So I think we're almost at a point of impasse at the moment where no one side has actually got the initiative. And I'd sort of expect that coming into the autumn when it's very difficult for military maneuver and coming into the winter. Russia's trying to achieve things with bringing North Korean troops in. The Ukraine is hoping for more and more Western weapon systems that are coming in. We're in that stalemate situation at the moment. I personally think that Ukraine will continue its special operations executive type activity, and we'll see an increase of that through the winter months in Russia. That is having a disproportionate effect on Russia's ability to maintain its frontline capability, and we'll start to see that impacting Russia much more through the end of 2024 into early 2025. And I think Ukraine will wrestle the initiative back properly towards mid-2025.
And in terms of any negotiations to end the war, an assessment by Jack Watling from the Royal United Services Institute, the think tank in London, is that the Kremlin believes it can achieve its objectives in Ukraine militarily right now as it stands, and is therefore not interested in any immediate negotiations. And he says it's the indispensable precondition for talks to actually stabilize the front and for Ukraine to end Russia's advance. How likely is that to happen? And do you agree with this assessment?
Yeah, Jack's brilliant. His assessments are brilliant. Yes, I do. But I think it's based on a lot of what is coming out from Russia and the fact that Russia has continued to advance slowly. And it's based on Putin's decision making because of that. Putin thinks he can win tactically. He can't. There's no way is he going to achieve his tactical advantages. But whilst he thinks he can, he's not going to want to negotiate. Vladimir Zelensky will not want to negotiate whilst there are Russian troops on Ukrainian soil unless he is forced into position to do that. If he is forced into position to do that, that's another level of danger, because what that will do is send a message out to other countries around the world that actually, if I take territory by force, I just have to wait a few years before the international community changes and will allow me to keep it. Xi Jinping is sitting watching Taiwan very carefully, and that could trigger, if we're not careful, a Southeast Asian pivot from Europe. We've got the Middle East in the middle. That gets very dangerous because they could all join up without any problem whatsoever. I've never seen a clear path to these sorts of things joining up, and therefore a global conflict. I can see a clear path now, and we have to be very careful.
Can you just outline what that path is?
The path would be President Zelensky is almost forced to give up the territory that Russia has captured so far for a peace agreement and peace guarantees and security guarantees and everything else. But Xi Jinping then turned around and thinks to himself, oh, well, okay, it's only got 3 years, 4 years of Western wrath before that it was accepted that they could keep that territory. I can handle 3 or 4 years of Western wrath economically, and he is already building up stocks of natural resources and everything else, and food and other things. I can handle that wrath if I take Taiwan militarily. He's practiced it. He's ready for it. He could do it. And therefore, he takes Taiwan militarily. If he pivots to take Taiwan militarily, then there's a potential that Japan would turn around and say, now is the only opportunity for us to get our Kuril Island that Russia has occupied since 1945 back. They could try and do that. They've changed the constitution. They're developing their military capability. They're in a position to do that now. And that would be a time when Kim Jong-un and North Korea would say, well, actually, the international community is focused on all of this. Now is the time for me to reunite Korea by invading, because everyone's occupied elsewhere and the Americans can't come and support South Korea. And he then nukes Seoul, and we then get into a completely different game. That is a path that is really concerning.
Ever since I've been kind of working and doing these kind of interviews, I've heard from people that, we are living through the most dangerous time. Do you think that, it's quite often I think, nah. I remember when I was like a kid, the kind of drills and the leaflets about nuclear war and what you had to do and hiding under the table and all that kind of thing. How would you assess that the situation we are in today, just as if you sit back and take a sort of a global look at it?
Comparing it historically, we're 1938. From a political perspective, our politicians in 1938 were going, no, there's not a problem. We're seeing all this build up and everything else, but it's all manageable. And then we get before the Second World War, Neville Chamberlain coming down the steps of the aircraft going, peace in our time. Our global leaders are waving the peace in our time bits of paper and not actually looking at what is physically going on around the world. And that physical going on, from a military perspective and analyzing it from a military perspective, the nations that are out there that are of concern are building what is called power projection military capability. You only build that, and what I mean by that is it's aircraft carriers. It's the ability to pick up large military forces, take them somewhere to do something. If you're a defensive organization, if you don't have the need to go and take your military somewhere else to do something, you don't need that power projection capability. China is producing it rapidly. They're producing more capital ships per year than we have in the Royal Navy, full stop. They're on their third aircraft carrier and growing. India has recognized the threat that's there, so they have got a plan to get their number of aircraft carriers up to 5. The Australians have recognized the threat that there is, so they're considering nuclear-powered submarines, not diesel-powered submarines, because they can project them forward further forward from a defensive perspective. The Japanese have changed in recent years the constitution to allow them to have an aircraft carrier. They're in the process of changing their helicopter carrier to an aircraft carrier to allow them to take part in more international operations militarily, to allow them to power project, to protect their islands as part of their island chain, and that was part of the language that they actually used. But a constitutional change, that is significant. And we're not seeing this, and we're not joining this together properly in anything that's coming out in our commentary. I think there are people recognizing it because we see, and here this is very UK perspective, but we see the first deployment of the UK's new aircraft carrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth, was down to Southeast Asia. The next deployment of our aircraft carrier group is again going to be down to Southeast Asia, and it's coming in with support from allied navies as well, NATO navies that are coming in, and we're seeing the commentary coming out of the NATO, the old NATO SecGen and the new NATO SecGen, suggesting a NATO pivot and focus in Southeast Asia because it's important from a global trade perspective. The world is so interconnected that we can't just focus on the North Atlantic anymore. We have to look at things from a global perspective.
And just finally, just to bring it back to Ukraine, what do you expect to happen then? I mean, winter's coming. Presumably, not a lot of movement along the front lines in the coming months. What do you see over the next few months?
Winter's coming. The run up to winter is bad for both sides because the mud sucks. And it will stick armored vehicles, and therefore you get into this attritional war, an infantry war. The Russians are losing huge numbers. This week they lost on one day, according to the Ukrainian military, 1,700 plus troops killed or wounded. They're pushing them through the meat grinder. Russia's having difficulty in maintaining the troops at the front. I think as we come into the winter, we will see an uptake in special operations executive type attacks inside Russia and inside occupied Ukraine from the Ukrainians. We will see the Russians continue with their infantry style meat grinder type attacks. When the ground freezes, we might see a little bit of armored maneuver from the Ukrainians, but they're not going to do that until they get the air capability that they need to provide local air superiority. That's not going to come in until sort of, I suspect, May, June next year at the earliest. That's when we'll see Ukraine trying to restart its counteroffensive and push the Russians back in the east. The Russians have tried to push the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region. They put quite a good force in together to attack in. It doesn't seem to have done anything. That tells me that the Russian military capability is in a much worse position than we think it is. Combine that with the fact that they're relying on North Korea for ammunition, China for electronics, Iran for its drones and missiles, and North Korea now for its troops, and recruiting in Africa using Wagner to bring Africans up into the Russian military. Russia's not in a good position militarily. So 2025, I think, will be pivotal.
Philip Ingram, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.